For this level, what I'm looking for is how rings are placed, how power-ups are placed, how level elements are used and iterated on, and how enemy elements are used and iterated on. The level starts with a solid rock and a bridge with 2 choppers on them. There's some rings hovering in the air that serve as an optional challenge. This isn't a new setup. You can see this same arrangement near the end of Act 1. The only difference is that one of the choppers jumps all the way up to the rings. However, this isn't a big difference because of Sonic being a giant screw attack. It doesn't matter what point in the air they're at, Sonic can always just barrel right through them. As you move on, you drop down onto a lower platform. There's a rock with a spring on top of it for some optional rings. It's easy to miss though. The sunflowers do a good job of covering up for the spring to make it harder to notice. This is an example where background objects serve a more functional purpose other than just to be pretty. You then go uphill onto a platform with a crab meat on top of it. It's no different than the first time you saw a crab meat in Stage 1. Next there's a bridge with 2 choppers on it, but this time the rings are on the bridge and not in the air. Were it not for the placement of the rings, this would otherwise be another redundant setup. Here the rings are placed in an area where it's more dangerous. So unless Sonic's moving to which he can enter the ball form, he's actually in more danger to get these rings. Next is a buzz bomber just before you drop down into another lower platform. It's still just high enough to not fly into Sonic. I would also consider this buzz bomber setup here somewhat redundant, as it was also at the end of Stage 1. On the level maps it shows that there's another buzz bomber that is facing to the right, but I've never seen this one before, and in all of my recordings this buzz bomber just never appears. There's a power-up hidden in the trees where the rock is. You can use the rock as a foothold to jump high enough to reach it. At the same time, the rock also serves to slow you down to see a new level element, which is this swinging platform. The swinging platform provides an alternate path to running up the tall curved ramp. The rings on the arc of the swinging platform also gets you to stick around long enough to see the spikes on the other side, so you can see it before you just jump on ahead. Here we're now beginning to see spikes used in lieu of solid rocks to slow the player down. The spike, however, is placed far enough so that when you do run up the tall curved ramp, you won't land right on top of it. There's enough space at the bottom for the player to gain speed to run up it. Continuing forward is another bridge section, this time with 3 choppers on it, the most we've seen so far. This is a more intense version of the previous ones. The middle chopper jumps the highest, in fact it jumps higher than the player's max jump height. The first one jumps at the same height as your max jump, and the last one jumps 1 tile below. But as I've said before, while they might be playing around with the different jump heights because of the fact of how Sonic's jump mechanics work, it's not all that meaningful, although it does make for some cool moments where you can bounce off of all 3 of them, so there is that going for it. Next you're on top of another tall curve ramp where you can drop down into ball form to gain massive speed for an upcoming loop-de-loop. You have to slow down to grab the rings, which is kind of awkward after you just ran through the chopper bridge. The path had split here, so let's go back and see what happens if you didn't go up the curve and continue left instead. You drop down to the lower ground where there are 2 motobugs. One of them is moving towards the right where it's easy to run and fall over it. There's a buzz bomber here that I'll have to come and talk about later. The second motobug just after is moving towards the left. This gives you ample time to jump over it, along with the rings guiding you to jump over the second one as you gain speed. It also serves as an optional challenge to keep you around where the motobug can pressure you. After that is a moving platform with a lower area where the path continues. The moving platform helps with the player speeding over the gap when you get the power-up at the end, which is the power sneakers. This increases Sonic's speed. However, there is a secret behind a secret. There's a breakable wall just behind the power sneaker power-up. There's a visual difference with it as well. This breakable wall is also made easier to go through with that very same power-up, so you do have enough space to speed through, roll into ball form, and break through all the breakable wall tiles. Doing this will get you 2 ring boxes and a barrier power-up. When you return from this area, you'll encounter another buzz bomber. But this is only if you go past a breakable wall, and even then it's just as ineffective as the one I mentioned before. It's just too high up. If you look on a level map, you'll see that it faces to the left, so it's more for when you go back with the super sneakers. You can spawn this enemy by tapping down before it makes any sense for it to be moving. However, this Buzz Bomber here is so ineffective with its placement that it may as well not even be there at all. Were it not for the level maps, I wouldn't have even realized that there was a Buzz Bomber here at all. It's just too high. The Super Sneakers is a neat bit of folded level design which makes it easy to run back up the tall curved wall. In fact, you run up and go so high that you can go clear over the chopper bridge and land safely in the loop-de-loop area. On the lower path, there's a motobug where you would drop down. And if you drop down from running from the right, you'll land on it as it's set up to reach the left wall. You'll notice how the motobugs are carefully placed in both their direction and where they are on the ground so that Sonic doesn't run into them at top speed. Drop down into lower ground, there's a rock near the edge where you would ride a swinging platform. Here you see an escalation of the challenge, where first you have the safe introduction of the swinging platform, and then you have one over spikes. From there, you have to jump onto the floating platforms, and these are the ones that drop after you land on them. And there's a sequence of 3 of them. This means you can't wait around and take your time with your jumps, you have to keep moving. One issue that may occur is that if you jump too high, you can accidentally move onto the layer above instead of landing on top of this swinging platform, which is kind of goofy. After you hop across the dropping platforms, there's a solid rock which has 3 rings above it. Another optional challenge to get you to use your jump mechanic, although this is a missed opportunity to have an enemy ambush you. Speaking of ambush, that's exactly what comes up. You have a bunch of red-eye neutrons across the flat ground here. What makes this different than the upper path in the first level is that there are these red springs that if you run into them, they'll bounce you back into where the red-eye neutrons were. So here they're actually somewhat more dangerous because of the use of the springs. This is also the first time we see sideways springs that are meant to hinder the player rather than to help them move forward. Another note is how while the spring can bounce you back into the red neutrons, it will not bounce you back into the spikes because of the rock that's in the way. Once again, this goes to show that the rocks aren't just placed willy-nilly, they actually serve a purpose. Past the platforms where the springs are to push you back is another solid rock, but this one is meant to slow you down for the next red-eye neutron ambush, because you're within the distance that triggers them to activate. Here the red-eye neutrons are combined with the crab meat, so while the neutrons pressure you to keep moving forward, where the ledge would slow you down to where the crab meat is at. Contrast this with how the setups were in the first level, where it was very easy to run past all the neutrons. And successfully making it past that, you can take a spring that bounces you back onto the main path. If your reaction is quick enough and you notice the rings, you can move Sonic left on top of the loop-de-loop for a ton of rings and an extra life. The rings and extra life are noticeable if you were to only go on the upper path as you go through the loop-de-loop. However, there's no way to reach them. You have to go down this lower path here. Continuing past the loop-de-loop is a short curved ramp where you will bump into a power-up hidden in the trees, which will be knocked into the ground. So this is some neat counterpoint. By engaging with one idea, you interact with another. This is also a way for the game to clue you in after the fact that stuff may be hidden in the trees for repeat playthroughs. That being said, this is probably one of the most free invincibility power-ups yet, although it doesn't do much good if you fall past the spikes into the bottomless pit. And this is because of the lack of walls for some reason. They look solid, but they're actually not. One last note before I go on to the next section is how the ramp here can be used to gain some serious air, which you can then use to bounce off one of the buzz bombers and skip the entire next section, if you take advantage of going on it a second time with Sonic's ball form. Here you have a more traditional platforming section. You have a series of platforms that move up and down over a pit of spikes. The rings serve as optional jumping challenges. It's one thing to platform across the moving platforms and over spikes, it's another to do it while getting all the rings. The next is you have 2 up-down moving platforms atop spikes with a buzz bomber. The first buzz bomber is likely to approach as you go to the first platform, and then there's another one that comes up as you're about to reach the checkpoint. After that, there's one last up and down moving platform over spikes. After the moving platforming section, you go onto some lower ground where there is a motobug. This is another example where a ground moving enemy occurs after a section where Sonic has to slow down, thus reducing the potential for the player to run into the one at top speed. You go uphill on a couple ledges to where there's a yellow eye neutron mixed with a crab meat. The yellow eye neutron pressures you to jump, or else get shot. I would say that this is the only yellow eye neutron in the whole level, but technically in the platform above, there is a second yellow eye neutron. However, because of the poor placement of this one, it's likely to go off without you ever seeing or noticing it. So this is bad enemy placement right here. So really on that optional platform to the left is just a Motobug. And on the platform above that is a ring box. Hidden in the tree is a spring for some more rings. When you jump to land on the ring box, you may notice the rings in the air off to the left. So here there's actually more of a hint compared to some of the setups in the level before, where there weren't any noticeable rings. After the rock that crab meat is sandwiched between is a bridge with 2 choppers. And this is almost an identical setup to the end of stage 1 and the one at the beginning of this stage. There's rings that guide your jump over the bridge, and there are more of them. So the only difference between this and the first one is the amount of rings and the jump heights of the choppers. You come to another tall curved ramp with rings that usher you to go down it, and the speed you gain will likely have you travel over both the crumbling ledges to then go into one of the S-shaped tunnels and finish the level. Observant players may notice that there's a lower area, and this is because the trees and the flowers indicate safety below. This is an example of how, your non-interactive background elements can be used for practical purposes, for gameplay purposes. If you go down and to the right, there's some spikes that block off progress. Well, they sort of block off progress. You can still jump over it and fall to your death, and once again, this is because Sonic has a very odd use of not using walls when it should. Here you have a red eye neutron that's placed to where the slopes are now working against you. Proceeding up to the left and then down the steps is a Motobug sandwiched between spikes and the wall. The Motobug is set up to move right towards the ledge where you can easily run over it, just like in the optional lower path before. The spikes will then stop you and allow the red eye neutron time to come at you along with the Motobug. So here you have a second instance of spikes being used in place of a solid rock to slow you down for another enemy to go through its routine. Now on the level map, it shows that there are 2 buzz bombers here, but I have never seen them in all of my recordings. So, there's just more bad placement here. Past the spike and down the crumbling ledge, there's a barrier power-up. Now you might think this is a free power-up, but really it's a reward for going down this hidden lower path. Next you come to another swinging setup over spikes, but this time the rock is at the very edge, so you have to time your movement so that you can walk off and land on top of the swinging spike. When you ride the swinging platform, there's a moving platform that you have to jump to instead of a stationary drop platform. The moving platform is timed with the swinging platform so that they always meet, so you don't have to wait for their timers to sync up or anything like that. The first Buzz Bomber here is kind of pointless. You can do nothing and they'll miss their shot. In fact, both of them will miss their shot. So the difference between the way the Buzz Bombers are placed here versus the moving platforms in the first act was that the first one was able to come back and depending on the timing of when you went on the platforms, it could have an effective shot at you. The second one also flew low enough to fly into you. And then the third one was just bounce fodder. That one flew way too high to be a danger even if you stood still. So if you remember how I said in the first video that the Buzz Bombers weren't superfluous even if you could run right past them, here they actually kind of are because they don't serve as an obstacle whether moving or standing still. This probably would have been a better use for the yellow eye neutron. So after crossing the pit of spikes from the moving platform, past a solid rock and up 2 ledges is another duo of Buzz Bombers. These Buzz Bombers you're likely to encounter as you're jumping up the steps. So these aren't like many of the ones in the first level or before where you could just run past them. So this is more effective placement of the Buzz Bombers. Past the Buzz Bombers is a crumbling ledge over a pit, and past that is another dangerous spring that'll bounce you backwards. The spring force is so strong you'll go over the gap even if the ledge already crumbled and are holding right. If you don't hold right to fight back against the spring force, it'll push you all the way over into the spike pits or into one of the buzz bombers you didn't kill. So I guess those 2 buzz bombers from earlier aren't totally superfluous. There's a ring box in front of the spike just before the exit, but you gotta make sure not to jump too high or else you'll jump onto the platform above and lose your reward. In conclusion, there's still some weird jank going on with the lack of walls. If you explore both lower paths, you'll see more full exploration of the swinging platform setups. If you stick to the upper path only, you'll only see it once. Because of how optional paths first go left, then fold back to the right, you don't miss out on much when the path reconvenes. The first one that you miss is just a bridge with 3 chopters and the loop-de-loop that you can easily backtrack to try out. And on the second one, you just don't go through the S-shaped tunnel and that's it. Every curved ramp has rings on it. There are more redundant or useless setups with buzz bombers, up to including ones that never show up. The newer gameplay ideas of the buzz bombers was over the moving platforms atop the spikes, and the 2 near the end of the bottom path as you platform up the steps. Crab meats remain some of the most ineffective enemies. While they are placed with other enemies to make for unique pairings, sometimes they may as well just be motobugs. There's only 3 in the whole level. There's also more motobugs in this level, about 6 of them in total. There are more spikes in this level overall, and one problem with the spikes that I'll mention now is how the player invulnerability doesn't seem to work, so the spikes will kind of combo you to death. To my recollection, that's not how they worked in Sonic 3, but I could be wrong. Red-eye neutrons are used in more effective ways. In each instance in this level, red-eye neutrons are placed in such a way that something has or will slow or reverse your progress, versus the first level where most instances you could run past all of them. We can see a progression of the challenges here. The choppers here are used in about 4 different parts of the level, but the variations between them is just so small. Choppers are also almost never paired with another enemy type, so I would say that is some missed potential right there. And that concludes my analysis of Stage 2.